get to our main information and discussion. We are recording. Perfect. Great minds think alike. Welcome, everyone. And again, some other colleagues will be joining us, but hopefully by now you've seen some of our other webinars. This is VSys Voices. I am Dana, and right now I have considerably longer hair in real life than in my headshot there on your screen. Many of us do. And I'm joined by Joan Catalino, Jared McCannell, and Todd McMullen as the rest of our team. I'm just going to be an MC and really let these three fine folks talk. And Lisa Lavinia, as always, is our tech maestra behind the scenes, making all of this possible for you, our beloved bespoke customers. So let's dig on into the very complicated subject of ROI. And today we're going to have a lot of time for discussion and give you some ideas on how to have a conversation about investing in volunteer engagement and the benefits and outcomes that we can show other leadership, executives and deciders and C-suite folks in your organizations. I know we primarily have healthcare organizations and hospitals represented on the call, so this is tilted a little bit towards that, but it also we're trying to show you some resources and material that really applies to everyone, and we also recognize, as we'll dig into, that hospitals have very specific metrics that they report on, and we'll talk about that as well. So let's dig on in. Next slide, please. There we go. And just what we're doing today, because this can be a very, very deep and complicated topic, is really a holistic approach. So not just the metrics that we're used to recording in our organizations, be those healthcare or other kinds of sectors, but really what are the multiple dimensions of impact on the mission that your volunteer activities and your volunteer programs are having? How are they moving the needle and making progress in your real mission impact? We'll offer you some resources for the business case development for both numbers and math and financials, and how that is truly in the classic definition of return on investment that's used by the corporate world. Some resources for that, but also the social factor, and some real case studies that many of which we'll have on our VSys Voices page to reference and read those details or dive as deep as you want to into those, and some other material that's archived with affiliate organizations. Some of you might already be members of those. So this is what we're really aiming for today. Again, this can be many, many hours of topics, but we also want to allow a lot of time to open up the discussion and see what successes or challenges you have faced in reporting a return on investment or getting investment in volunteer programs, particularly in our recent pandemic times. And I'll hand this off to Todd for our next slide.
Yay. Okay, so as Dana has mentioned, two things that are very important. First of all, ROI is incredibly complicated, and we're going to talk about part of why that is in just a second, because hopefully today we're going to be able to kind of break it down for you and then give you some planning tools for how to build a real structure that will demonstrate ROI to all of the different stakeholders. That's the holistic volunteer ROI concept that Dana was just talking about. The business cases and case studies just reinforce that. So as you can see up here on the screen, it's a fairly complicated process. And while you're reading this, because it's kind of involved, you probably have to read it 3 times. But it comes from some good friends of ours at True Impact who do a really good job, by the way, of consulting on this topic. I'm going to tell a story. So this is a story that I heard in a training on this topic many, many years ago. And so we're going to presume that there is a case of a task given where a bunch of volunteers are helping out some staff members to hand out peanut butter sandwiches on the west side of Chicago. And if you were to go back in time on the subject of ROI 30 years, then that would probably just be a matter of counting the number of peanut butter sandwiches that went out the door. And then there was some talk, and I don't want to put timetables on this really, so forget the 30 years, but then it sort of matured to, well, we need to know how many volunteer hours were involved with distributing those peanut butter sandwiches. And then it kind of turned into, well, what was the cost of the peanut butter? How much did the sandwiches cost us? And are we getting an actual return on financial investment? And then it turned into, well, how do we know the answer to that question? And therefore, we had to start going out the door with the peanut butter sandwiches, so to speak, and asking people who were given the peanut butter sandwiches, well, gee, what happened to this peanut butter sandwich? And then the statistical people really started getting involved and saying, okay, well, what percentage of them got fed to the dogs? Which ones of them got sold for drugs? Which ones got, actually into the digestive systems? And then the health people got involved and wanted to know, okay, was it appropriate to feed them peanut butter, okay, and jelly, or should we really have been feeding them something else? And what I learned really quickly over the years, and most of you folks have as well, of course, is that when you're talking about return on investment, you have to start by asking, well, who is the investor? Who is it that wants to know what the return is? And unfortunately, in volunteerism, we've got about 20 of them. There's the people who contributed the peanut butter. There's the people who contributed the money to buy the peanut butter. There's the volunteers themselves. There's the staff members. There are the bean counters inside of the organization. And there are about a dozen other audiences. There's the grant writers and the grant people. And, of course, the grants are changing constantly. And that's true inside of healthcare as well as outside of healthcare. And then there's the federal regulations, okay? And so the first question we recommend that you ask is, who are my investors? What am I trying to get back to them? Who are they? And what do they want? And then you kind of have to compile that holistic model Dana was talking about that will address all of their particular needs. And that's where the fun comes in. And my colleagues are going to be talking a little bit more about that, so I'm going to shut up. Right. But there's my peanut butter sandwich story, folks, okay? And, Rosie, you will, because there's just so many different ways to look at it.
Yeah.
And, of course, for us, for you folks, peanut butter is a much different thing.
I'm hungry for a sandwich, and I just had opened.
Yes, now I need to go get myself a peanut butter sandwich.
Yeah, wonderful. So next, and Jared will ease us into, what is that difference between the nonprofit and the for-profit? What does that look like? Not specifically metrics, but we know there's a different approach.
You can hear me? Am I on mute?
No, we got you.
Well, we got you.
For all these months of Zoom, I can't figure out WebEx.
There you go. We got you on screen. Go for it, Jared.
Thank you, and sorry for that rough transition. But ROI models do differ between nonprofits and for-profits, and part of that is nonprofits tend to be mission-driven. We're not necessarily judging our success on the returns that we get for our investors or for trustees, but we're looking at a number of other measurables, including the rate at which people continue to volunteer with you, or the satisfaction of your, in the case of hospitals, of your clients. In the case of nonprofits, your patrons, clients, participants, or members. And beyond that, we look at a number of other soft, I guess is the word I'm looking for, values in regard to how we measure ROI in nonprofits. The biggest difference is we're measuring a number of things that aren't as concrete as you might find in for-profits. Again, a for-profit, they have the one major goal of making money, and then beyond that, ROI is something that can inform strategies of how to do that. Whereas with nonprofits, we're looking at a much more holistic, as you've already heard a few times, approaches, much more holistic approach. And you have to be more creative as to what sorts of things you're looking for measuring and how it actually impacts your mission. And if you are looking at things that don't necessarily connect to your mission, then they may not have the same sort of value that you're looking for in an ROI model. So the big thing to keep in mind is, when working with ROI models for nonprofits, make sure that you're really touching upon the things that make your nonprofit or hospital or other organization, make sure that what you're touching upon reflects the values, mission, and direction that your hospital or organization are going.
That's great on the differences. And Jared, if you want to have a sentence or two before we shift to Joan and CSR, is what we know that there are also common elements to measure between for-profit and nonprofit. What do you think are those off the top of your head? And we also have resources about this later on if you want to circle back.
Sure. Some of the commonalities, would certainly be things like revenue. Are you getting money back in from the money you're investing in your programs? Even with a nonprofit, there's still a lot of money involved. And I think nonprofits are still quite misunderstood by the greater corporate world in regard to what we're doing, how we're doing it, and what our budgeting process looks like. But yes, revenue is absolutely something that might be in common. Customer satisfaction is certainly something that is in common, and however you might refer to your customers as clients, patients, members, and so on and so forth, constituencies. So those are also some things in common. But you also might look at productivity, a number of other things that measure the success of your organization or your work, and you'll find a lot of similarities between the for-profit world and the non-profit world.
Exactly. Yeah, and we'll have specific tools to help break this down too, so you don't have to think of it all from scratch. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jared. And moving on to Joan and talking a little bit about the CSR side of corporate social responsibility and how that can play into this equation as well.
So this concept of return on investment, really, its roots are in the for-profit world. And the corporate social responsibility world has grown immensely over the past 20 years. It really didn't even exist much before that. They have the resources to really study and develop models that we should take a look at and we have some partners with them, like with True Impact. They're very involved with volunteer modeling too. So there's a lot we can be learning from the corporate volunteer world, and this is a little chart of McDonald's and their infographic about their scorecards. And I've seen a lot of scorecards from volunteer programs, but for the most part, they talk about the number of volunteers, the number of hours, perhaps the amount of money saved. And we're going to get a little bit further along when we talk about this, our infographic, to report some more of the social impact that they're talking about here with corporate social responsibility scorecard. But I want to say the concept of ROI and volunteerism is not new. We've struggled with it for decades. I have an article here. It's from the fall of 1995, and I'll read it. It says, volunteers are designing new roles, structures, and cost-saving strategies to help their hospitals achieve strategic priorities with surprising results for hospital quality and the bottom line. Volunteer services generate hard dollar savings for hospitals. Since 1995, we've been having this same conversation. However, what we didn't have then that we have now, and this is where the corporate world really teaches a lot, is the data tools. Everything we were doing back then was handwritten, standing on our own, not integrated with patient satisfaction, not integrated with HCAPs, not integrated. So that's a huge shift when the ROI conversation starts happening in the social sector. The other thing I want to point out here is that corporate CSR models don't have to worry about a Form 990 every year. They have different tax implications that they have to address. But if your hospital is nonprofit, you have to fill out a Form 990 to the IRS every year, justifying your non-for-profit status. And few people really realize that line 6, not line 66, is a really long form in the 990. Line 6 asks, and you have to report to the IRS, what is the total number of volunteers estimated if necessary? So our traditional benchmarks of number of volunteers, number of hours, amount of money saved don't go away. What we're trying to propose here is you expand upon them, and we'll try and work with you to identify what that expansion looks like.
Exactly. And speaking of perfect segues, that helps set up this next slide. Go ahead, Lisa. We're using a standalone model like we have with, just kind of pretty typical metrics that we use of time, money calculators, and independent sector has data every year. They do a grand study where they average out per state and for nationally for the USA of what is the average value of volunteer time. If you have no other way of measuring it against the exact skill set and doing an assessment and comparison that way, that's a great resource to use if you don't already know about it. And then also the enterprise model of really getting all of that incorporated into your strategic planning benchmark. So ideally, we don't always live in an ideal world, as we all know, but ideally, everything about your volunteer activities is woven or is a piece of the strategic plan and has its measurable benchmarks. Again, especially healthcare, hospitals, hospice, that kind of, social services sector. That's going to have some specific regulations and reportables and deliverables. So if we're talking about the standalone model, you just kind of siloed or department of one, or your information is not fully integrated with everything else. There's some tools and ways to measure that. But really a more enterprise model fits into the idea of moving towards doing this in a holistic way, not just between your departments, but looking at not just numbers and beams to move around and count in the financial sense. So sounds good. Go ahead.
I would just like to mention if your hospital or organization doesn't currently use that sort of enterprise model, looking at every department and combining that information, you can start your own, you can use your own standalone model and come up with goals that you're going to track, and then share that with your supervisors and have them share that up the line. Because a lot of times, this ROI of your volunteer program is an afterthought or not even considered when looking at some of the bigger picture stuff the C-suite folks might be thinking of, and it's part of our job as a volunteer coordinator to make sure that information is flowing up. Now, you don't necessarily, once it goes up, you don't have the control over it, so you need to be an advocate to your direct supervisor about the value of this program or the value of the effort that you're putting in.
Exactly.
Let me see if I can summarize here really fast.
Yeah.
I need my coworkers to help me out.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got holistic models that involve business models and use cases. And they can either be standalone or enterprise, as Dana was just talking about. They can involve corporate policies and procedures or not, which is, again, what you were just talking about. And Jared, you were talking about how they might follow a for-profit or non-profit model, and there's different, elements to those. And so we need to start figuring out, and we're going to be talking about it a little bit later, folks, so I don't want you to feel like we're losing you. We're going to talk about, okay, how do you determine which pathway to follow through the morass, if you will, of all of these different elements and models. So, yeah, I just wanted to summarize for a second before you move on, Dana.
Yeah, the next slide starts to do that. So let's go to the next slide, Todd, because that starts to pull this all together as we're talking about it. Sorry, Joan, did you have something?
Just one last thing.
Sure.
One thing I neglected to mention back on that corporate social responsibility model infographic is that if as peers, with my healthcare peers, I often remind them, remember also that our world has changed remarkably since 1995 because literally 24% of our hospitals now in the United States are investor-owned for-profit. And many of them are still using volunteers. This discussion for a whole nother time. But if you are with a for-profit hospital, this model is not what we're going to discuss. Doesn't apply to you. If you are a non-for-profit hospital and you are a member of the volunteer groups or your peer groups locally, and there's a mix of for-profit and non-for-profit hospitals, which often happens, be aware of that dynamic. And the conversation is totally different in the C-suite at a for-profit hospital than it is for a non-profit hospital, as is the ROI.
Oh, you cut out.
Okay.
And Todd, this is what you were talking about.
Right.
These are just some examples of data sources or line items to think about as we do weave together the traditional metrics as well as this holistic model or using an enterprise model or standalone model.
Before you even try to figure out all those models and everything else, you got to have some basics here. So if you want to jot these down on your piece of paper, step number one, I talked about a little while ago, is you got to know who your investors are, who is it that you're trying to please. And then step number two, what do they want? Because they want lots of different crazy things, especially, with everything Joan was just talking about, everything Jared was just talking about, there's lots of different things that they want. And then third, now we're getting to this slide, okay, this is kind of at the other end, the other bookend, besides the who wants what, is what have we got? What are our data sources? Okay, because if our data sources are not going to generate the answers to what the folks want, who your investors want, then we have to start to solve that problem. Because that garbage in, garbage out, right? We've all heard that, right? Okay, so there's some examples here on the slide of different inputs, as we used to call them. And if you capture the right set of those, then you will get outputs, which are the actual number of hours and salary in benefit savings and things like that, which can be then translated into outcomes, so input to outcomes down the road, all right, that actually get your ROI reports pulled together. So an ROI report, we're going to show you an example of one in a minute, is going to contain elements of all of that. So what did the investor want, whoever it is, possibly even the volunteer themselves? What did you create in order to, get them what they wanted? What are the inputs that led to that output? And how much of it is object and subject, which is where all that modeling comes into play, all right? So at least you got to have those frameworks of the basics, Now let's talk about both ends of the bookend.
Exactly. Weaving together like a beautiful quilt. And that takes us into the next slide with Jared really talking about a few of the kind of sample data points and sources where you can grab this. You don't have to make this up off the top of your head. Go ahead, Jared.
Sure. So there's a number of ways to collect this data. There's surveys, there's the certifications you can get through different oversight agencies. There's local, state, regional, national laws and regulatory systems that you can use. So some example surveys, HCAHPS is something you might be familiar with, the Hospital Consumer Assessment of Healthcare Providers in Systems. It's one of my favorite acronyms. That's one way to, it's a standardized set of questions, and it's a great way to collect data that you can compare against other hospitals as well, so you get a benchmark there. I do believe Joan has a lot more information about HCAHPS, so for just a moment, Joan, do you want to chime in and add anything about HCAHPS before I move on?
Well, that actually ties into the next slide, so let's just go to that.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Speaking of perfect segues. So go ahead, Joan, and go ahead. Yeah.
So for years I grappled with this because I worked in large hospital systems and then I worked for a hospital association. So unless you can produce data, that's been my experience in these organizations, you don't exist. You become invisible. And unless your data can speak to the databases that they value and they really use as metrics, you also don't exist. So I was always looking for a way to make sure that we could identify data that supports whatever my organization metric capturing system is. And in hospitals, there are many of them. HCAHPS are the driver of a lot, and we all know this. I think everybody on the call is from a hospital. And so I went on a campaign a few years ago to start collecting dashboard systems from different systems. And you know what the dashboards are. The one in front of us is 25 pages long, double-sided. And each page is from a large system, national system, and each page lists all these different metrics. And they go on and on and on. And if you sat through a director's meeting or a manager meeting, when your stats are flashed up on the screen and you are not in the right performance, it's like public shaming. There's a culture of healthcare and institutions, particularly large ones, is so closely tied to these statistics and the people that capture them. We want to make sure that we find a way to use this data because it's of value. I'm okay with the traditional volunteer ROI checker, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's kind of standalone, and those statistics, if you can find a way to reflect that in your hospital system or hospital dashboard, good. I did when I was working at my own hospital, but it took years of persuasion to include the volunteers. And we had to earn that spot. We had to produce. And so it's challenging work, but if you want to elevate your ROI experience and your visibility within your institution, the way to go is search for ways to appear in these data capture systems that are already in existence and earn a spot within that environment. I think that's all I want to say about this dashboard and the hospital metrics. It's fierce. It's fierce work. No, I had one more thing. I'm sorry. I want to say one more thing. And most of us don't have the background and training in data. Remember, my career has been long. I started out with a typewriter. So I really had to go to school to learn about data. And I still take classes to learn about data, how it's obtained, how it's manipulated, how it's stored. mean, you may think about how to use an Excel sheet. What is a much bigger world out there now? And that's where our hospital peers are. That's where they are. They become data gurus and still have other large organizations, and not only nationally, but internationally now. So if you don't have training in data management and what the whole world of data is all about, I encourage you to go out and find some classes and courses to acquaint yourself with how to work within this environment. It is counterintuitive to our natural caring side of our brain. It is just being caring. It's fierce.
And I'll add to that, Joan. It's great to learn about this yourself, just so you have a deeper understanding of how this works. Yes, and this is a great thing to delegate because there are volunteers who love to do this and are super wonky on data analysis and data visualization and understanding it. So there can be a lot of overwhelm in our job, especially now in healthcare and the times we're in. So I just want to encourage that you don't have to do this by yourself. If you have an interest, this is a great thing to learn about. I've had to learn about it because it's not my natural interest or inclination is math and data. And to me, it's become really interesting, but also this is another great way that you can have anyone anywhere work as a remote volunteer to help you gain this understanding or even lead a project on helping identify what kind of data sets and points of what you're already doing with volunteers can be fit into this. So you never feel like you have to do it alone. We've got your back, and there's a lot of other people who can too.
This may not be in your job description either, and so you just have to accept that.
Exactly.
I don't know one volunteer director's job description that includes understanding that. I mean, it's just not there. This is the reality of today's world.
Yeah, but more and more it's the kind of thing that is creeping into, the mission creep and the extra duties as assigned that we all get every day. And Todd, if you just want to touch on in the next slide, just really quick, what tools Bespoke has, but also recognizing other tools that people might be using in this quest. Yep, Todd, unmute yourself.
Dana, well, Todd's unmuting himself.
I got it.
I got you.
Hit the button.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have a cough today, so I muted it. But thanks, Dana, for that segue. And just back to the point that Joan was making a minute ago about the importance of gathering data. Yes, VSys does have the ability to do some of this stuff, to define what it is that you want to capture if you're not already doing it, and what it is that you would like to accomplish with what you're capturing. Okay, so a lot of that, some of those inputs and outputs that we were talking about. And we could do both objective and subjective data, including, testimonials from your volunteers about their experience, which gets lashed in with some of the other stuff. So now is not the time for us to talk about. We don't actually usually talk about product in these webinars. But if you have any questions about that, contact your support person. And by the way, if you have any questions about ROI in general or how to map your strategy on that, also talk to your support person, and they can get hold of us, and we can help you out.
Yep, exactly.
I want to add something to that. Through COVID-19, and my peers on the call have heard me say this before, one of the things I've been passionate about is making sure that, in addition to VSys, that the volunteer management tracking system vendors stay in the game. If they go under after COVID-19, we are in big trouble as a sector. So talk to I really encourage you to talk to your VSys reps and partner with them. Figure out how to use bridges between what data you collect and coming from VSys One into your hospital. There's ways to do all that. And it doesn't have to be VSys One. It could be any one of the volunteer management software vendors. They are your friends when it comes to ROI, and I don't think as a sector we take advantage of the resources they have to offer us in this sector as much as we should.
So again, thank you, Joan, and get in touch with your VSys support person because there's always probably more that you don't know that the software VSys One can do. It's very robust. It can do a lot of things. As much as you want to learn about it, the support is here with specific questions. And we actually have Amy Lionheart says that that these actually have been added to her responsibilities. So thanks for putting that in the chat, Amy. That more and more this is becoming part of our job description, even if we didn't initially sign up for it. And they're using PRC for their survey. So when a couple more slides, we're going to give you some tips and resources, and then we're going to dig into a really robust discussion. So Amy, get ready to be unmuted for that discussion in a couple more slides. And for now, let's go on to the next one.
And while you do that, Dana, just please, I put up a question for everybody. Does anybody have any current issues with ROI that you would like to discuss and to help get some help navigating? Because when we get to the discussion that Dana is talking about, we might not just open it up to poor Amy. Okay, we would love to hear from you.
That's my point, Todd, and we're getting to that. So you're spoiler alert. Todd's giving us spoilers.
Yes, I love doing that.
Yes,
you want to be thinking about what do you need.
Exactly, and we're getting to that. But kind of setting that up, this does all tie together in what we are good at as leaders of volunteers, which is often thinking outside the box, and what we know our successes and what is having a mission impact with activities and the programs that our volunteers are participating in. We know those things. We see them every day, and this discussion and these tools and resources and support systems and models of doing things are really just to add to how you can tell the story effectively, to who you need to tell the story to, whether that's standalone or enterprise or the CFO of your company or getting into that survey data set that Joan was talking about on your hospital annual report. All of this is to serve, how can we tell the story of the impact that we know our volunteers have more effectively, both in metrics and in grabbing some data that we haven't maybe thought about or grabbed before and showing that to people and showing how that's making a difference. So just the thinking outside the box is how we move into the discussion here. And we'll go, Lisa, please go to the next slide. There we go. And really talking about this as some of these dimensions, and I believe Joan and Jared, you had some things to say about this one as well.
Yes, indeed. And Joan, I'm going to let you take it because I think I can fill in the gaps.
Tag team.
Okay. So we started talking about this in the beginning, that the traditional ROI calculator, and I hope that you're familiar with what that is, and we showed some of the fields that each slide back that we use ourselves within our own sector, volunteer return on investment. That started out almost as an exercise just for us to try and measure our worth to begin with when it was a standalone. And as we've discussed, the hospital sector has changed so much and evolved so much since we started way back when. And so has hospital data measurement changed and gotten so much more sophisticated. So one of the toughest things it's still about was all the sophistication and the patient satisfaction and engagement. So encounter the same challenge. Is how do you measure ROI beyond time and money? How do you measure patient satisfaction? I mean, money you count it, So how do you measure? I mean, Todd talked about the peanut butter sandwiches before, but then there was a long line of other dimensions beyond how many sandwiches. And this was talked about some of the dimensions of return on investment beyond time and money. It's pretty much focused on the healthcare setting, but how can we prove our value, our influence, the return on the investment in our department, on the accreditation process, and there's a ton of them we've got in our hospitals, on public advocacy. That's kind of been in our lane for a few years, but we could do a better job of that. On the hospital award systems, and certainly now on community benefits, and that's a whole other workshop in itself, what the influence we have on community benefits outside the hospital walls. Not new. The measurement and the data of it, though, is new. Credentialing, licensing, all of these, all the legal and regs that we have to follow. Magnet certification. Are you part of that process? Is your data part of that process? Are you on any of these teams? Quality, safety, patient-family experience. Fundraising has been in our lane for decades. We know this. Fundraising, advocacy, and service. But now data is driving fundraising too, and it's expanding beyond $50 million gifts now are nothing, and they used to be a big deal. Now they're coming in a dime a dozen. How do we play a role in that, and how do we measure it? And where does that data then go? Who do we give it to? What's the report that we fill out? Where's the line that we fill in? What's our link to the master data tracking system that the hospital has? So that's what this is. It's meant to be provocative. It's meant to be for a checklist for you to think about. And you may be at a point in your department's development where you're ready to deal with just one of these, and the others will come along. But most certainly, and it's really hard to do all of them, if you could, if you had enough helpers. But most certainly, this.
Joan, we lost audience for you for a second.
Yeah. The most important thing of this slide is mission, goals, and objectives.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That is the most important thing on this slide. And that's where you start. That's where you start. What impact and how do you measure it? The answer would be different for each system. And some of the answers lie in the work that's been done in the corporate social responsibility world. They figured out how to measure social impact beyond time and money. How do we adapt that in our sector?
Great. Jared, anything to fill in before we start to scoot over to our discussion questions?
Got a couple things I'd like to mention.
Sure.
We were talking about data sources, and we kind of jumped to the HCAPs, but we didn't really delve into the other two. But one of them was Joint Commission, and for those that are familiar with that, this is the regulatory agency that oversees accreditation and other types of credentialing, licensing, regulatory stuff. And the reason I bring it back up is you can see a number of these related topics, as I just mentioned, accreditation, compliance, credentialing, legal, and regulatory. If those systems for collecting data don't include or don't already tell your story, find ways that you can mine that data and help tell your story. So even if your volunteer program isn't included necessarily or specifically in those, there is information in there that could really help paint your picture, and that will also bring a little legitimacy to your own. If you end up doing within your department a standalone ROI type report, the more you can link it to the other data sources that are regularly used, the better. And so that's the one thing I wanted to kind of tag onto that and wrap up that other slide as well.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I like it when you and Joan tag team in your healthcare expertise on these topics because it's so important. And this is really a panel about, where do you start? What are some tools in your toolbox? What are some sources to go to? And I want to just real quick show the next slide before we dive into our discussion questions, Lisa, if you want to go that. If you want some deeper reading on the social impact, so if Lisa, if you want to go to, there we go. Ta-da! Yay, we're there. I love that graphic. Just if you happen to have an Engage membership, and I'm actually going to talk to Rob Jackson and Betsy McFarland Engage and see if we can just reproduce the PDF of this past article. But this is a great white paper and essay and pretty deep research on measuring the social impact and translating that to classic ROI. So we just wanted to put this up as a link and a resource. If you happen to have an Engage membership, great, you can get it right now. Otherwise, in a few more days, we should be able to have the PDF of the full article up on our VSys Voices page. So we want to have time for a discussion. Let's dig into our discussion questions where anyone can be unmuted and you can put in the chat. There we go.
And if you don't speak up, you might hear more stories about peanut butter.
and I'll just be hungry. So kind of, pulling together what we've mentioned for approaches and models and tools to have in the toolbox, how can your agency's volunteer engagement just be better resourced and supported by funding and personnel? Because part of what we want to get out of any exercise in using data or doing a return on investment summary is who's it actually benefiting? Where are the benefits to your program and to the mission impact? And what of the metrics and data are measured and shared right now? And what other ones can we think about sharing? So This is first part of the discussion. We have a few other questions that might dig into it, depending on where we go with it. So if anyone, doesn't have to be Amy, we called her out earlier, but if you want to put in the chat and ask Lisa can unmute you and we can get going with this, or our panelists can also fill in some of their answers that may or may not be related to peanut butter sandwiches.
Aww. There's only 11 people here. We might just unmute. What do you think?
What do you think, Lisa? We can unmute everyone unless someone wants to keep themselves muted because they're doing something else in the background or whatever the case may be.
Hail, we're all here. And so you got one person with a whine in the background. But other than that, not bad.
I had a question for the group also. Who likes that, or who likes doing this? That affects a lot the answers to these questions.
I don't know what it is, and like it's just like acting like you know.
I think by the silence of that probably tells you how many people on this call actually love data.
Thank you, Amy. So, Amy, did they just hand this as your job description, or was this something you signed up for ahead of time?
No, did not sign up for it. Actually, the reporting structure in my organization changed recently. Over the past year, I've now been reporting to our new Chief Experience Officer. And so we are looking very closely at analytics at this point. And so your question number 2, what volunteer metrics and data are measured and shared with the C-suite now. Previously, we really were not sharing anything other than annual hours of service, total number of FTEs, and roughly how much we're saving the organization by employing volunteers. But now we're looking at the possibility of determining which of our volunteers are potentially able to work in peer-to-peer support, so asking them detailed questioning when they're onboarding about whether or not if they've ever had a stroke or known someone, and would they be interested in serving as a peer-to-peer. So collecting more information, medical information, collecting more demographics. We're really looking at diversifying our patient and family advisory committees. We've never collected demographics and really, looked at those metrics and measured them. So that's something that we're starting to do now, and we're moving. Our organization is going to be moving all. We're now a 7-hospital organization, so we're going to move everyone onto VSys Live, and that will be able to help us to get all the data points that we need.
That's great. And again, it's using the tools you have with the VMS, and also just what Todd was talking about earlier of any data entry is, you have to decide what you're going to measure and how you're going to measure it and what those benchmarks are. So that's a really great model for others to use, and that's why we want to have these open discussions and kind of learn from each other. As much as we've got our panel of experts always at the ready and your support system people to contact if you have specific questions about data gathering or analysis within the bespoke software suite or with any of us for how we've encountered models of data collection. But I think that's important, Amy, and I think that's the trend that we must all be moving into, but particularly breaking out of the mold of healthcare of, they've always got their regular measurables and deliverables, but we by necessity, I think in the last year have seen getting into this more holistic model and this real mission impact piece of it.
Yeah, if I can just point out, I mean, from what I heard, Amy, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you've got several different sets of inputs. You've got your patient care committee. You've got the HCAP survey results. You've got the C-suite. I mean, am I missing anything? Because that is a lot of interlaced data, and all of their elements are not the same. What am I missing there? What did I not jot down?
No, absolutely. And, right now, we're really trying to explore, how do we better matchmake with the departments, and so utilizing the data to if we had information right now, obviously we don't have the information as far as medical data collection goes, but when we do have more information, if someone has had a hip replacement and they want to serve as a support to someone who is perhaps riddled with anxiety over their upcoming, hip replacement, we could call upon those volunteers to say, hey, perhaps we can have this person call you, or you can call them,
And that is absolutely brilliant, Amy. The fact that you're thinking about not just the external outputs and outcomes that everybody else wants, but as a program yourself, you can use the inputs that are coming in, just exactly like you said. I love that example. We can apply these things internally to our programs as well. And Amy, as you progress down that very complicated path, I know I, for one, and maybe my coworkers here would as well, we would love to be kept abreast of that. Maybe we can think of some things that we can help you with. Melissa is actually on the call, Melissa Bergen. She can help you, and I the rest of our support staff try to figure out the best ways to incorporate what you ultimately come up with into VSys and where we can help out with that. That would be fun, Amy. I would love that.
I have a question. Amy. Where are you putting that data? Are you starting to capture it yet? And when you do find out graphics, or if they want to be part of a hospital support group, does that go into where do you send that? And does that program, wherever you're sending it, talk to the hospital data folks to share those demographics? How are you talking between databases?
So Joan, that's an excellent question, because we have not started collecting that data yet. But you walk a fine line. You can't do it when you're onboarding. You can't do it in the onboarding process, because what are the optics of that? You're onboarding and you're asking someone in an application. I think that's against the law, actually. I don't think you can ask about medical conditions, but at some point as an optional, perhaps, we're working with Michelle on creating those types of forms, but to collect that, and say, hey, this is optional, you don't have to answer, but if you're interested in potentially working with us with any one of these programs, we're really focused. Right now, we're razor focused on increasing HCAP scores, and how do we get there? So how can volunteer services best work closely together with patient experience, and I think that's one surefire way to get volunteers who are qualified to work with those patients and hopefully, have them have an overall better experience.
I'm really glad that you keep mentioning the word experience too, because even when you're onboarding people, really fascinating, even when you're onboarding, you absolutely cannot ask them about their medical background. You are completely right. But you can ask questions, hey, look, do you have any experience in ambulatory care? And if they happen to have been a patient in that area, they're probably going to say yes. And that's you're just asking them, but you're getting some of the same information. But you're right. Follow-up surveys later on down the road in their experience, progressively asking them, which of course our system can handle, by the way, is great as well.
Yeah, it's just different in a way, Amy, than if you were asking for, and I'm minimizing this, this is not a good example, but we've done this for years when we've needed help with additional projects throughout the hospital. We're used to that, you know. Go ask the volunteers, can they staff this? Can they do the Christmas party? Now, and it's a more refined way of looking at the volunteers as a resource for much more than their immediate assignment. They fall into the same category as volunteers do three things. You know, they raise money, they provide service, and they run programs, and they provide advocacy too. So the overall arch has not changed. It's business is patient satisfaction, family engagement has really, and it has become more robust because of the ability to capture data. We had a patient relations program in my hospital since 1953. The concept of patient relations and asking about their experience is not new at all. And the concern is not new. But what is new is this ability to capture the data into large and analyze it and use it. That's what's new. So that's why I keep coming back to data, understanding it. We know about the patient experience. That's not it. It's this transition of the volunteer world into the data world and our ability to talk to one another.
And Joan, I'm going to keep the discussion moving because we have less than 10 minutes left. But also, so Lisa, if you want to go to the next discussion question, which are related to all of this. This is just a natural progression. And Ann Mallon is also asking, like, has any volunteer group created a scorecard, and could we share those format and categories? And that's really great tie-in to whom do we provide the both required information, and then also like how can we get these up to the C-suite for the bigger decisions to be made to resource our departments, and what role does our natural ability as storytellers or working with our development department and marketing pals in other departments play a role in that ROI and benchmarking measurements. But has anyone heard of a scorecard, or is that something that, do we have a model of that, or we could put that one up? Either for a panelist, or if anyone wants to ask to unmute, we can get rolling in this part of it as well.
I would like to offer that when I was with the Hospital Association, it took 4 years. And we did create a hospital volunteer impact survey, and we did it in partnership with True Impact, and that's why I keep going back to the CSR community has a lot to offer us. It's a robust tool. It was a dare to do to identify different categories that partnered with other categories that hospitals value, you know. I don't know where it stands now back at the Hospital Association, but the model is out there. And it does exist, and maybe one way to get it is to swing back with True Impact. It was a lot of work and very effective.
And we don't have to reinvent these wheels or these tools, and that's part of what we're, again, we have, an hour to do, many, many years worth of research and unpack it. So it's really about sparking some ideas, offering some tools that already exist within VSys Live, VSys One, and the bespoke suite, and what other ways that we can learn from each other, including Amy. So thank you for being a part of that discussion as well. And this is also, again, this is a starting off point of this conversation where we point you in direction. There's tools, there's resources, and what we have is not just this session archived, but also the VSys Voices page, and we'll get to that in a moment. But I just want to open up the floor in our last few minutes. Is there anyone else that didn't get to unmute yet that has something to share or a question to ask of your peers or the panel?
Hey, Dana, while people are muting, I've got a few things I'd like to
Oh,
comment on.
yeah, please go ahead, Jared. Yeah.
Quick.
Go for it, Jared.
No, I asked if we could go back one slide real quick.
Oh, back one slide, yes. If Lisa is our driver, she can do that. Let's go.
I'll comment on number 1 and number 3 of the previous slide.
There we go. Yep.
So the first one, we didn't really address each one of these. We kind of talked in general about all of them. So one thing I want to mention about how your agency's volunteer engagement could be better resourced or supported, and they the example here is by funding our personnel. If you can get together with your fundraising folks and find out how many of your volunteers donated, because that's a measurement of engagement, but also not just how the volunteers are sharing their time, but also we know for a fact that engaged volunteers give more and more often than other folks, other donors or non-engaged constituents. You know, we have folks that just get a mailer saying support our hospital or support our organization. If those folks were invested with their heart and mind already, that ask is much easier, and that give on their side is much easier. And so, you know, the other thing, what other metrics and data could be used to measure or reflect mission impact? Again, find those folks who are measuring that already and collecting that data, and find a way to articulate how your program fits into that. So we can jump up to the next slide again. And just on number 2 of the next slide, about the age of consumerism, I just want to share that all of this, you know, the inputs, outputs, and outcomes, that's exactly what, you know, you want to be tracking and measuring, because what you're really doing is taking that information and advocating for your program, for your organization, to the greater public. And then to that last one, the role of storytelling, this is another great example of, you know, how you can collect some anecdotal data that really says a lot. Storytelling tells so much more than data can in a way that people can understand, and then the data can support that storytelling often.
Wonderful. And I want to, in our last 2 minutes, just show, if Lisa, you want to go to the additional resources. We do have calculator tools that we think are really helpful. So again, you don't have to reinvent a lot of the stuff that exists, and we're happy to point you towards it, not just in this presentation, but on the VSys Voices pages. So Toby Johnson does a lot of great research and has a lot of great articles, and particularly Sterling Volunteers has you just plug it in, you go to that link on their website, and again, you'll have easy access to this link. And something that I wanted to include is we don't always hear a funder's perspective of why they want to give money or not give money towards volunteer engagement in programs that are doing that. So there's a short video here just to watch if you have a few minutes from Dane Justice is a Lady Foundation of what helps them decide, and they have a nice little graph on how they measure, from a funder's perspective, volunteer impact on mission. On the mission of any agency that they're giving grants to from their foundation. And then we also have, if we go to the next one, in addition to our resources, there's the VSys Voices. We also, you know, we partner closely and we work closely with Association Alive and National Alliance and Energize, which is now shifted to becoming Engage. They just recently changed their name to Engage. So all of this is, we do the collection for you to put it on the VSys Voices webpage. So if you see links to Alive and Sterling and other things, we've gone through and done a really great sorting of what we think is really pertinent to the points that we want to bring up, and that is some of the best tools to use with our affiliate organizations. And again, you've got your representative, support representative to contact, and they can get easily in touch with any of us if you have any follow-up questions. And we're really, really glad you've taken the time to join us today. This is a deep, deep subject, and hopefully we've given you a lot to think about and work with. So we're really glad to have you here.
Really fast in conclusion. Okay, so yes, we do have all those resources up on the Voices page. We're putting some more up related to this topic. Those aren't actually up yet because we have another one of these webinars next week. And Melissa also wanted us to remind you that she has a whole reporting series of webinars up on her technical page that she thinks you guys might benefit from related to this, because it all leads to those outputs that need to be presented to everybody. So thank you, folks. Thank you. And that's all we got.
Yes, and that's what we got this time.
That's a wrap, Tina.
We'll see you next time. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank
you.